It was supposed to be a day like any other, a peaceful Sunday morning in a small Texas town. The sun poured through the stained glass windows, casting a warm, colorful glow over the congregation. Inside the church, the faithful were gathered for their weekly service, waiting for their preacher, Reverend Thomas Caldwell, to deliver his sermon. It was a moment of serenity until it wasn't. Reverend Caldwell stood at the pulpit, a man known for his powerful presence and his ability to move his congregation with every word. As he began his sermon, his voice was steady, his words familiar to those who had come to listen. But then, just as he reached a crucial point in his message, everything changed. "We must repent," Caldwell said, his tone firm as he looked out over the congregation. "Repent for our sins, for our mistakes, for the lies we've told, before it's too late." And then, in an instant, the unthinkable happened. Bang! The sound of a single gunshot rang out, slicing through the air, shattering the quiet reverence of the service. The congregation gasped, their heads snapping toward the altar. Reverend Caldwell, the man who had stood before them countless times, fell to the ground. His body crumpled on the very altar where he had so often preached about redemption and salvation. In front of his wife, in front of his daughter, in front of the very people he had dedicated his life to. The man who had once been a symbol of faith, a shepherd to his flock, was now lying lifeless in a pool of blood. As the room erupted into chaos, the woman who had pulled the trigger didn't flee. She didn't run. Instead, she sat down on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, as if the weight of what she had just done had shattered her very soul. Her cries echoed through the stunned church, filling the air with an eerie tension. This was the moment it all became real. This was where she would be arrested, sitting in the midst of the horror she had just caused. What led to this shocking moment? Who was this woman, and why had she chosen this way to settle her long-buried anger and resentment? The investigation revealed a tragic, twisted story. The woman who shot Reverend Caldwell was not some stranger, but a part of his past. A past he had worked hard to bury. She was his baby mama, someone he had been involved with years earlier. A relationship that had been swept under the rug, forgotten by most, but never truly gone. Her motives weren't immediately clear, but as the pieces of their story were pieced together, it became evident that this wasn't a random act of violence. It was the culmination of years of resentment, betrayal, and an explosive mixture of emotions that had finally boiled over. What had Reverend Caldwell done to this woman? How had their lives become so entangled, and how did this relationship, the one he had tried to bury, come back to haunt him in such a violent, public way? The more the investigation uncovered, the more it became clear that the preacher's seemingly perfect life had been anything but. His past had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to explode, and it had done so with a vengeance, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Reverend Caldwell had preached forgiveness, redemption, and love. But was he truly living by those principles? Or had his past sins been too great to ignore, leading to a violent reckoning? The investigation had just begun, and disturbing things were discovered. And with it, the question lingered. What had truly pushed this woman to murder the man who had once been the father of her child? This isn't just a story of a preacher's tragic end. It's the unraveling of a life built on secrets and lies. It's about betrayal, retribution, and the destructive power of a past that refuses to stay buried. Stay with us as we dig deeper into the mystery. And if you want to hear more, make sure to subscribe. The answers may shock you, and the truth, when revealed, might just be more complicated than anyone ever imagined. Reverend Thomas Caldwell was more than just a preacher. He was an important part of his community. The kind of man whose presence filled the room, whose words brought comfort and guidance to those who needed it most. Married to Emily, the woman everyone knew and admired, they were the picture-perfect couple. From the outside, their life appeared flawless. They had everything: love, faith, a strong marriage, and a congregation that looked up to them. The Caldwells were the ideal family until you dug deeper. Thomas's journey hadn't been easy. He came from modest beginnings, working tirelessly to build a life he could be proud of. He had earned his place at the pulpit, his success a testament to his hard work and his devotion to God. Together, Thomas and Emily raised their child Sarah with the same values they had built their own lives upon: respect, faith, and community. The church, where Thomas had delivered countless sermons, was their home, their sanctuary. The congregation trusted him, believed in him, and loved him. But like all families, the Caldwells had their private moments. Behind the smiles shared on Sunday mornings and the family portraits that hung on their walls, Thomas had hidden parts of his past that no one could see. Emily, though beloved by the church, had no idea what her husband had carried with him over the years. She never suspected a thing. How could she? Thomas had always been a loving husband, a devoted father. He had everything anyone could ask for: his faith, his family, his ministry. But it wasn't enough to shield him from the consequences of his past. Beneath the surface, there were cracks, small, invisible at first, but growing ever so slowly. Years ago, long before he became the revered pastor of his church, Thomas had made a decision. A decision that, in time, would come back to haunt him. A mistake. A relationship he had tried to bury. A relationship that had led to the birth of a child. A secret he had kept from Emily, from Sarah, and from the entire congregation. No one knew about this hidden chapter of his life. No one knew that his past was alive, waiting for a moment of reckoning. The perfect life, the perfect family, the loving wife. They were all part of the carefully constructed facade that Thomas had worked so hard to maintain. But deep down, the past never truly went away. It lingered, waiting, and that past, that secret, would come rushing to the forefront, exploding in the worst possible way. What was Thomas hiding? What was it that had been lurking in the shadows, threatening to destroy everything he had built? How would it all unravel? The answers were about to become terrifyingly clear. Before the pulpit, before the well-respected family man and preacher, there was Tanya Lewis. She was the woman who had once shared Thomas Caldwell's world in a way Emily never could. Their relationship wasn't built on calm, steady love. It was electric, charged with passion, but also riddled with turmoil. The early days with Tanya were filled with highs and lows, love that burned fiercely, but ultimately, a relationship that crumbled under the weight of secrets, lying, and infidelity. In the midst of it all, Tanya had a child, a reminder of the relationship Thomas wanted to forget. She had his son, a child who would become a silent witness to the pain, betrayal, and resentment that festered in the years to come. For a time, they tried to make it work, or so Tanya hoped. But Thomas, looking for an escape, eventually walked away, leaving her to raise their child alone. He moved on. He married Emily, the woman who would become his perfect wife, the woman he would build his life with, the woman he would stand in front of the church and profess his love for. But Tanya, left behind, struggled. She fought to make sense of everything. Why he had left her, why he had abandoned their child, and why he refused to be part of their son's life. As the years passed, her bitterness only grew. Every attempt to reach out to Thomas, every cry for help, was met with silence. Tanya's calls were unanswered, her messages ignored. And when their child fell ill, she turned to Thomas in desperation, hoping for some help, some acknowledgement of the child they both created. But Thomas refused to respond. In his mind, Tanya's pleas were nothing more than manipulation. He convinced himself it was all a strategy to pull him back into her life, a life he no longer wanted to be part of. The child's sickness, the late-night phone calls, he saw them as an inconvenience, something that interrupted his carefully constructed life with Emily. What Tanya didn't know was that Thomas had already moved on, had already chosen the life he had. She felt left behind, abandoned, not just by Thomas, but by the man she had once believed would be there for her. Each unanswered call, each ignored message, chipped away at her sense of self-worth. Her heart, once full of love for Thomas, had been slowly replaced with a gnawing pain, a resentment that refused to be quieted. But Tanya wasn't just angry at the past. Her anger ran deeper than that. It was about what Thomas had, a life, a family, a future, and what he had refused to give her, a place in that future. She didn't just want apologies or closure. She wanted something far more tangible, something that Thomas refused to give her. And that desire, that need, would drive her to a point of no return. What was Tanya willing to do to get what she wanted? And what was the price she was willing to pay for revenge? Sunday morning began as a typical service at the Caldwell family church. Peaceful, serene, and filled with the usual sounds of greeting and fellowship. The congregation settled into their pews, ready for a Sunday of worship. Outside, the bells rang, echoing through the Texas town, but inside the sanctuary, there was something else brewing. A tension so thick it hung in the air, unnoticed by all but one person. Tanya Lewis stepped quietly into the back of the church. Dressed plainly, she blended in with the crowd, but her eyes were locked on one man, the man who had once been everything to her, Thomas Caldwell. He was standing at the pulpit, delivering his sermon as if nothing in the world could shake him. But he hadn't seen her. He didn't know she was there. And so Tanya rose. Her steps were deliberate, slow. No one in the congregation noticed the shift, her eyes never leaving Thomas. With a cold resolve, she reached beneath her jacket, pulling out a small revolver, a .38 caliber that glinted in the light. In one swift motion, she aimed at Thomas and fired. The shot rang out, piercing the air of the church, cutting through the words of his sermon. Thomas's body collapsed to the altar, a lifeless heap, his sermon unfinished, his words dying on his lips. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the room. People stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. And Tanya? She didn't flee. She didn't run. As Thomas lay motionless in front of her, Tanya knelt. She fell to the floor, the gun still gripped tightly in her hand, but it was her wailing cry that filled the church. Tears streamed down her face, and her body shook uncontrollably as she cried out, torn between the agony of her actions and the years of unaddressed pain that had led her to this point. She was not proud. She was broken. But the moment had come, and the weight of everything she had carried crashed down on her. The congregation stood paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Thomas's wife, Emily, sat in shock, her face ashen. Her heart shattered as she watched her husband's blood stain the church floor. The child she had borne with Thomas, their daughter, looked on in confusion, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before her young eyes. Tanya remained kneeling, weeping, unable to tear herself away from the place where she had just shattered her past and her future forever. It wasn't until the sheriff's deputies arrived, guns drawn, that she was pulled from the scene. She was arrested, but there was no defiance, no struggle. Tanya didn't resist. Her body sagged, defeated. What had brought Tanya to this violent moment? Was it just revenge, or was it the culmination of a deep, unresolved pain? As she was led away from the altar, the church remained eerily silent, the aftermath of her actions leaving a chilling stillness in its wake. Questions swirled in the air like smoke. What was it that had pushed Tanya over the edge? Why this moment? Why in front of the very people who had known Thomas best? What had he done that had made this act of violence seem like the only choice? The answers, it seemed, would take more than a simple investigation to uncover. As Tanya was led away by police, her face a mask of sorrow and exhaustion, the congregation was left to grapple with the unthinkable. A preacher, beloved by all, had been gunned down at the altar by the very woman who once shared his life. At first, it seemed like a moment of madness, an isolated act of violence fueled by grief, rage, and revenge. But as detectives combed through Tanya's past, a darker truth began to surface. Tanya had spent years carrying the weight of unresolved pain, but the investigation would reveal something far more complicated than simple betrayal. Years earlier, Tanya and Thomas had invested in a business together. Started off slow with no real returns, and at first it seemed like their joint venture might never make it. But then, something changed. The business began to take off. It yielded profits, and for a time it seemed like their hard work would pay off. But somewhere along the way, Thomas took full control. He gradually shifted the balance of power in his favor, managing the business and holding on to the profits, while Tanya was left on the sidelines, struggling financially. Tanya had always believed they would share the wealth, that they were partners in more than just the relationship. But over time, Thomas became distant, both emotionally and financially. When Tanya needed help, especially when their child fell ill, she reached out, hoping Thomas would offer support. She asked him for a portion of the money they had made from the business to pay for medical treatment. But Thomas, now deeply embedded in his new life with Emily, rejected her every time. He dismissed her requests as manipulative, convinced that she was trying to exploit him. Each rejection stung. Tanya, who had stood by him through the years, watched as Thomas thrived in his new life, ignoring her pleas for help. While he built his ministry and his family, Tanya struggled to make ends meet, alone with their sick child. And each time she tried to get him to step in, he refused, leaving her with no choice but to bear the weight of it all alone. What Tanya couldn't shake was the injustice of it all. The business they had started together was thriving, but Thomas was keeping it all for himself. It wasn't just about the money. It was the feeling of being discarded, of being treated like her needs didn't matter, while he went on to live the life he had always wanted, untouched by the past. That anger built up over time, festering inside her. And then, one fateful Sunday, Tanya's pain, resentment, and desperation reached a breaking point. When she walked into the church that morning, her thoughts were not on forgiveness or faith. Her thoughts were on the years of abandonment, the rejection, and the man who had taken everything she had worked for. The investigation revealed that Tanya's rage wasn't just about a broken heart. It was about being left behind, about watching as Thomas took control of everything they had once shared. And as they pieced together her story, it became clear. Tanya had been pushed to the edge by a man who once promised to share his life with her, but who ultimately turned his back when she needed him most. And now, in a single, irreversible moment, Tanya had made him feel that pain too. As the courtroom drama unfolded, it was clear that the shockwaves of Thomas Caldwell's death would extend far beyond the confines of the church and the small Texas town where it all began. The trial became a focal point for the community, and for Tanya, it was the moment she would face the full consequences of her actions. But the real weight of the tragedy wasn't just on Tanya's shoulders. It was on Emily, Thomas's wife, and Sarah, their young daughter, who would have to carry the burden of this horror for the rest of their lives. Emily Caldwell, once the beloved preacher's wife, was now a widow. Her world had been upended in a single violent moment. In the courtroom, her face reflected a mixture of grief, disbelief, and a search for answers that no one could provide. Sarah, their young daughter, was left to grow up in the shadow of a tragedy that no child should ever have to face. The innocence of her childhood was stolen in an instant, and now she would carry the weight of her father's violent death for years to come. The people who had once looked up to Thomas as a man of faith and leadership now had to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality of his betrayal, and it was clear that the impact on Sarah would be profound. In the eyes of the law, Tanya's act of violence was a premeditated crime, and the legal consequences were severe. Tanya faced charges of first-degree murder. Her actions, walking into a place of worship, pulling a concealed weapon, and shooting Thomas in front of his wife, child, and congregation, left little room for argument in the eyes of the court. It was a brutal and calculated act, one that would result in a lengthy prison sentence. For Tanya, the trial was the beginning of a long and uncertain future. The evidence stacked against her was overwhelming, and the emotional toll of what she had done weighed heavily on her. In the end, Tanya was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once loving mother who had been driven to acts of rage by her unhealed wounds now faced the consequences of her actions, and there would be no escaping the reality of her crime. Tanya's actions also raised difficult questions for the community. The relationship between Thomas and Tanya had been complicated, to say the least. The betrayal, the abandonment, and the money, the refusal to help with Sarah's medical treatment, all added layers of complexity to the tragedy. How could one person's actions, fueled by years of unresolved pain, lead to such devastating consequences? As Emily and Sarah tried to rebuild their lives, the community wrestled with the ripple effects of Tanya's decision. The trust that had once existed within the church and in the tight-knit community was shattered, and it would take years, if not decades, to heal the wounds left by that Sunday morning. For Tanya, the trial and the life sentence she faced were only the beginning of her reckoning. There would be no return from the actions she had taken, and the consequences of her rage would follow her for the rest of her life. The question remained, was Tanya justified in her anger, or had the pursuit of vengeance cost her everything, leaving her with nothing but a life behind bars? While Tanya served her sentence, the saga of tragedy was far from over. In the years that followed, another heartbreaking chapter unfolded. Tanya's sick son, whom she had once hoped would receive help from Thomas, tragically passed away on June 24, 2023, adding yet another layer of sorrow to the already unimaginable story. The truth is often more tragic than we can imagine. The death of Thomas Caldwell was not just the end of one man's life, it was the unraveling of an entire community. A community once bound by faith, trust, and shared experiences now left with shattered pieces, struggling to find meaning in the devastation that followed. The preacher who had once inspired, the woman who felt abandoned by him, and the family whose lives were irrevocably altered. All of them bear the scars of what happened that fateful Sunday morning. What do you think? Was Tanya justified in her actions, driven by years of hurt and rejection? Or did the weight of her anger consume her and lead her down a dark path? Was it just revenge? Or was there something more at play in the way Thomas's choices affected everything that happened? As you reflect on the story of Tanya, Thomas, Emily, and Sarah, ask yourself,